In the vast and sun-scorched plains of the Wild West, where the wind whispered through the sagebrush and the horizon stretched endlessly, there lived a man who was known to all. His name was Lucas Cole, a cowboy who owned one of the largest cattle ranches in the region. With his finely tailored clothes, spurs that gleamed under the sun, and a rugged face that matched his rough lifestyle, Lucas was the picture of a man who had everything. He was powerful, wealthy, and above all arrogant. Lucas Cole was the kind of man who believed that the world revolved around him. His cattle roamed free across thousands of acres of land. His ranch hands obeyed his every command, and he enjoyed the attention of anyone who crossed his path. He had earned his wealth through hard work, or so he claimed, but most knew it was his shrewdness and sometimes ruthless business dealings that had made him rich. He was a man of privilege and pride, someone who thought that no one could touch him, especially the people who lived in the nearby Apache village. The Apache tribe had lived in these lands for centuries, long before settlers like Lucas had arrived. But to Lucas, they were nothing more than a nuisance. He believed that his ranch and the land belonged to him by right, and anyone who thought otherwise was beneath him. His arrogance, born from his wealth and power, made him believe that he could do whatever he pleased without consequences. One hot afternoon, as the sun beat down on the dusty plains, Lucas mounted his horse, his favorite steed, a strong and fast animal that had carried him through countless challenges. His spurs jangled with each movement, a sound that echoed across the silent, wide-open space. He was headed into the Apache village not for any particular reason, but because he enjoyed reminding the villagers of who held the power in the area. The Apache people were known for their quiet strength, their connection to the land, and their deep respect for their traditions. Amara, a widow who had lost her husband in a battle with settlers some years ago, lived in the village with her young son. Though she had lost her husband, she had never lost her spirit. She was known for her beauty, her wisdom, and the quiet dignity she carried with her every day. Amara had always kept to herself, taking care of her son and helping her people when needed, but she was not one to back down from injustice. That day, as the villagers went about their daily tasks, Lucas rode into the village with a wide, arrogant grin on his face. He had been here before, and he had always been met with a mixture of fear and respect from the villagers. But this time he wanted something more. He wanted to remind them, especially the women, of his power. As he rode through the village, his eyes landed on Amara, standing near the well with a basket of water in her hands. She was tall, strong, and graceful, with a look of determination in her eyes that set her apart from others. Her long dark hair, tied back in a simple braid, blew gently in the wind. Lucas's eyes narrowed as he noticed her. There was something about Amara that intrigued him. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, her quiet confidence, or maybe it was simply because he liked to see how far he could push people before they broke. Without warning, Lucas spurred his horse forward, the animal's hooves pounding against the dirt road. He rode directly up to Amara, who stood calmly by the well. The villagers around them fell silent, sensing that something was about to happen. Lucas slowed his horse to a stop, the powerful animal snorting beneath him. He looked down at Amara with a smirk, his eyes filled with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "Move out of the way, woman," Lucas called out in a condescending tone. "You're blocking my path." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at him immediately. She was used to people like him, men who thought their wealth and status gave them the right to treat others however they pleased. She simply continued with her task, drawing water from the well as though Lucas's presence was no more important than the birds flying overhead. Lucas's smirk grew wider. He wasn't used to being ignored. He was the man who controlled this land, the one who had the power to make anyone's life difficult. He wasn't used to people, especially women, standing up to him without any warning. Lucas kicked his horse forward and brought his booted foot up to strike Amara. The force of the kick hit her shin, sending a jolt of pain through her body. The crowd gasped in shock, but no one dared to speak up. The villagers knew the power Lucas held, and they feared the consequences of challenging him. Amara's body trembled with the sudden pain, but she did not fall. She stood tall, her back straight, her head held high. She did not scream or cry out like many would have expected. Instead, her eyes met Lucas's with a quiet, fiery determination. She was not the type of woman to beg for mercy. In that moment, something inside her changed. The anger and humiliation began to burn within her, and she knew that she would not let this go. Lucas, meanwhile, was pleased with his action. He had expected Amara to break down or beg for forgiveness, but when she did neither, his confidence only grew. He believed he had made his point clear. No one, not even the Apache, could stand against him. "Well, I guess that's that," Lucas said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Get out of my way unless you want more." With that, he spurred his horse and rode off, his laughter echoing through the village. The villagers watched in silence, too afraid to say anything. But Amara remained standing at the well, her fist clenched, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The pain in her leg was nothing compared to the rage building inside her. As Lucas rode off into the distance, Amara turned to face the village. She knew that she couldn't let this go, not now. The time had come for her to take a stand, and she would make sure that Lucas Cole would never forget the name of the Apache widow he had humiliated. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the dry, rolling plains of the Wild West. The days were long and harsh, but for Amara, the passing hours had become an endless river of thoughts. The anger that had burned inside her since Lucas Cole kicked her in front of the villagers had not yet faded. She could feel it pulsing through her veins, turning into something sharper, something stronger. The humiliation and pain were still fresh, but now they were like kindling, ready to catch fire. Amara sat by her small campfire that evening, the flames flickering against the night's cool air. Her son Eli slept soundly next to her, his small chest rising and falling in the quiet of the desert night. Amara gently adjusted the blanket over him, her movements soft and tender. As a mother, she had always put Eli's needs first, making sure he was safe and cared for. But tonight her thoughts were not on him. They were on the arrogant cowboy, Lucas Cole. She had always known that the settlers and ranchers who came to the land had no respect for her people. The Apache were viewed as little more than obstacles to progress, their traditions dismissed, their rights ignored. But it had never hurt as much as it did now in that moment of personal injustice. Lucas's actions were not just about one woman. They were about everything that had been taken from her people, their land, their dignity, their lives. As the night stretched on, Amara's anger slowly turned into determination. She had spent many years learning the ways of the land. Her father had taught her how to track animals, how to read the weather, and how to survive in the harshest of conditions. She had learned from the wise elders in her village, listening carefully to their stories and lessons. These teachings were not just for survival, they were for strength, resilience, and now for revenge. But Amara was no fool. She knew that her anger could not be the driving force behind her actions. Revenge had to be precise, careful, and well-planned. She had to make Lucas understand that he could not treat the Apache people as if they were beneath him, and she would do it in a way that would make him regret ever crossing her. The next morning, while the village stirred to life with the sounds of everyday activities, Amara went to work. She did not speak to anyone about her plan. The fewer people who knew, the better. She had learned long ago that the Apache people were often too quick to offer help or advice, not understanding the depths of her resolve. This was something personal, something she would carry out alone. She knew Lucas's routine well. He was a man of pride and habit, and that worked to her advantage. Every morning he rode out to check on his cattle, always taking the same route across the plains. He was predictable, and Amara would use that predictability against him. It was one of the many things she had learned from her time living in the desert. The land had its rhythms, its patterns, and if you paid attention, you could find a way to bend those rhythms to your will. Amara's first step in her plan was to disrupt Lucas's supply of fresh water. His ranch, like many others in the region, relied on a well that sat at the base of a small hill. The well was the lifeblood of his ranch, and without it, his cattle would suffer and his operations would come to a halt. Amara knew that if she could temporarily prevent him from accessing it, it would be a blow to his pride. Over the next few days, Amara worked in secret. She and a small group of trusted friends from the village, who had also been wronged by the settlers, went to the well at night. They carefully covered it with rocks and debris, making it look like a simple accident, something that could easily be fixed with a few hours of hard work. But it wasn't an accident. Amara had deliberately blocked the well, forcing Lucas to waste time and resources repairing it. The first morning after the well was blocked, Lucas rode out to check on his cattle only to discover the problem. He cursed loudly, shaking his fists at the sky in frustration. His men scrambled to clear the debris, but it would take longer than expected. Amara watched from a distance, hidden among the rocks, a small but satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This was only the beginning. The next step in her plan was more subtle but equally effective. Amara knew that Lucas's prized cattle were his most valuable asset. Without them, he would lose his fortune. So, one night, she and her group of trackers slipped quietly onto his ranch. They did not harm the cattle, but they made sure to drive them into the thickest parts of the forest, where it would be nearly impossible for Lucas's men to find them. By morning, they were gone, scattered far from the ranch and hidden in the dense woods. When Lucas discovered that his cattle were missing, he was furious. His pride and anger were on full display as he paced back and forth on the ranch, shouting at his workers. He immediately blamed them for being careless, unaware that it was Amara's doing. But the damage had been done. His reputation, which had once been untouchable, was now beginning to tarnish. Word spread quickly across the region. Lucas Cole's cattle had gone missing, and no one knew why. As the days passed, Lucas grew more paranoid. He knew someone was messing with him, but he couldn't figure out who. He became obsessed with finding out the identity of the person responsible, but Amara was always one step ahead. She had planned everything carefully, and she knew that the more Lucas searched for answers, the more he would wear himself down. His frustration, she hoped, would cloud his judgment and make him more vulnerable to her final move. By the end of the week, Lucas had become a shadow of the man he once was. The well was still out of order. His cattle were scattered across the plains, and his workers were growing restless. His arrogance had turned into desperation, and the people around him could sense it. The once proud cowboy who had ridden through the village with a grin on his face was now a man haunted by the consequences of his own actions. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger, something more dangerous was at play. Amara, meanwhile, continued her quiet work. She did not take pleasure in Lucas's misery. Rather, she felt a sense of justice. She had not resorted to violence or aggression. Instead, she had used her knowledge of the land, her wit, and her patience to bring about the cowboy's downfall. She knew that this was just the beginning, but it was enough for now. Lucas had been humbled, and that was the first step in making him realize the error of his ways. As she watched the sun set over the horizon, Amara felt a sense of calm wash over her. The storm she had started was just beginning, and she was ready to see it through to the end. She was no longer the woman who had been kicked by Lucas Cole in front of the villagers. She was someone far stronger, far more capable, and far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. And soon he would learn that the Apache widow he had underestimated was not a woman to be trifled with. The days following the mysterious events that plagued Lucas Cole's ranch grew tense. The air in the village was thick with rumors. Amara, despite the growing whispers around her, remained calm. She knew she had to be careful. Every move she made now could determine the outcome of her carefully planned revenge. Lucas was a man of wealth, influence, and pride, and his temper was growing shorter with each passing day. But Amara had something he didn't: patience. Lucas Cole had never been a man to show weakness. He was used to commanding respect with a few words, a flash of gold, or the weight of his reputation. But now he was forced to confront a reality that unsettled him. Things were slipping out of his control. His cattle were scattered, his well had been blocked, and even his workers began to talk. They were tired of his harsh demands, and their loyalty was weakening. Slowly, his confidence was being chipped away, and he found himself looking over his shoulder at every turn, wondering who was behind the trouble. He had no idea that the woman he had humiliated weeks ago, the Apache widow, was the one behind it all. One evening, after a long day of searching for his missing cattle, Lucas stood in his grand ranch house, staring out the window into the vast, empty plains. His hands gripped the edges of the windowsill as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, leaving only a cold, empty sky behind. He had never been more frustrated. His money, his land, and his cattle had always been a symbol of his power. But now those things were slipping away, and the people he had once dismissed as weak were proving him wrong. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was one of his men, a younger fellow named Hank, who had been working for Lucas for years. He had always been loyal, but lately his attitude had started to change. "What is it, Hank?" Lucas's voice was sharp, his patience thinning. Hank entered, looking uneasy. "Boss, there's something you need to see." We found something strange up by the north field. Lucas frowned. What is it this time? Another prank? Hank hesitated before speaking. It's a trail, sir. A trail of hoof prints, but they're not from any of our horses. Lucas stood up quickly. Where? Hank led him outside, and they rode together to the north field. The air was still, the sky darkening above them, but as they reached the area Hank had spoken of, Lucas could see it, a series of hoof prints in the dirt, leading off into the thick brush. They were fresh, as if someone had passed through just hours earlier. This wasn't here yesterday, Lucas muttered, bending down to examine the tracks. His mind raced and a feeling of unease crept over him. Whoever was doing this knew exactly where to strike and when to disappear. It was clever, almost too clever. I'll send a team to follow them, sir, Hank suggested, looking at Lucas with concern. No, Lucas said quickly, standing up. I'll go myself. I want to see who's been playing games with me. Meanwhile, back in the village, Amara was quietly preparing for the next phase of her plan. She had heard about the discovery of the hoof prints and knew that it was only a matter of time before Lucas started searching for answers. She had made sure to leave just enough of a trail for him to follow, enough to keep him guessing, but not enough to catch her. Amara had always been a skilled tracker, but she was no ordinary tracker. She had learned from the best of the Apache, using her knowledge of the land and the animals to blend into her surroundings. She knew how to leave a trail, but she also knew how to erase it. As she prepared for the next move, Amara's mind wandered back to that fateful day when Lucas had kicked her. At that moment, she had sworn to herself that she would never allow him to think he could treat her, or anyone in her village, like that again. She had been humiliated, yes, but that humiliation had become her strength. It had fueled her desire for justice, and now she was making Lucas pay for his arrogance. But she also knew that revenge was not just about making him suffer. It was about sending a message. Lucas had to learn that his actions had consequences, and Amara intended to make sure that he would never forget the lesson. As Lucas and Hank rode through the thick brush, the trail of hoofprints grew more confusing. They wound through the trees, leading them deeper into unfamiliar territory. Lucas's frustration mounted with each passing moment. Whoever was behind this was toying with him, using the landscape to hide their movements. Stay alert, Lucas ordered Hank. Whoever did this is close. I can feel it. Hank nodded but didn't respond. The forest was dense, and the sounds of nature seemed to close in around them, amplifying the tension in the air. The farther they went, the more uneasy Lucas felt. Suddenly they heard a rustling sound in the bushes ahead. Both men stopped, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. They had no idea what or who was out there, but they were prepared for anything. I'll go ahead, Lucas said, his voice low. Stay here. He dismounted from his horse and carefully approached the sound. His heart pounded in his chest and his senses were heightened. He was certain he was about to confront the person responsible for the trouble at his ranch. As he reached the edge of the bushes, he stopped. There, standing in front of him, was Amara. She had stepped out of the shadows with a quiet grace, her eyes meeting his with a calm, unwavering gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Lucas stared at her, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. He had been expecting a trap, but not this calm, confident woman who stood before him unafraid. You, Lucas said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Yes, me, Amara replied, her tone steady. You've been looking for me, Lucas Cole. The recognition hit him like a thunderclap. This was the woman he had kicked, the woman who had quietly watched as he made his mistakes. He felt a rush of anger, but beneath it there was something else, fear. Amara wasn't the weak, helpless widow he had thought her to be. She was a force to be reckoned with. I've been waiting for you to find me, Amara said, her voice carrying a calm authority. And now that you have, I hope you're ready to face the consequences of your actions. Lucas took a step back, his hand tightening on the hilt of his gun. What are you planning? Amara smiled, a smile that was not kind. What I'm planning is simple. For you to learn that you cannot treat people however you please. Your power, your wealth, none of that matters when you have made an enemy of someone who knows the land better than you ever will. The days grew colder as the wind picked up across the plains, and Lucas Cole found himself more restless than ever. His once proud ranch, a symbol of his success, had become a source of constant frustration. His cattle were still scattered across the hills, His workers had started to grow discontent, and his wells, the lifeblood of the land, were still blocked. It was as though the universe itself had conspired against him. Lucas had spent every day searching for answers, trying to piece together the mystery of who had been causing all the problems. He had grown increasingly paranoid, and his temper had become even shorter. The people he had once commanded with a word now avoided him. Even his closest men, those who had worked beside him for years, began to question his leadership. But despite all his anger and frustration, he could not find the person behind it all. Deep inside, he knew it was her, the Apache widow. The same woman he had kicked and humiliated in front of everyone. He hadn't seen her since that day, but he could feel her presence lingering in the back of his mind. It was clear now that she had been behind the problems at his ranch. But Lucas was stubborn, and he refused to admit that a woman, especially one like her, could cause him so much trouble. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Lucas rode out to check on his cattle once more. He was tired, frustrated, and no closer to finding a solution. As he rode through the hills, the silence around him felt oppressive. There was no sound of the cattle grazing, no familiar hum of the wind through the grass. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, Lucas's horse came to a halt. Ahead, he saw something strange. It was a small trail of broken branches and disturbed dirt, leading off into the trees. He frowned, dismounting from his horse and walking forward cautiously. Whoever had been causing him so much trouble had been here recently. He could feel it in the air, the same sense of being watched that had plagued him for weeks. He followed the trail, his mind racing. Every step he took seemed to bring him deeper into the forest, farther from his ranch and his men. As he moved through the trees, he heard the sound of something, a soft rustle, a faint movement behind him. His instincts kicked in and he reached for his gun, ready for whatever might appear. Then out of the shadows, Amara appeared again, her presence like a quiet storm. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on his with a calmness that unnerved him. This time she was not hiding in the brush or lurking in the background. She was standing before him, facing him directly with no fear in her eyes. "Still searching for answers, Lucas?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. Lucas took a step back, his hand tightening around the grip of his gun. His eyes narrowed as he studied her. She looked different than the last time he saw her. There was no sign of fear or weakness in her demeanor now. She stood tall, strong, and unafraid. "What do you want?" Lucas demanded, his voice cold. "You've caused enough trouble already." Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I want you to understand that you can't treat people the way you've treated me or my people. You think that because you have wealth and power you can do whatever you like, but you're wrong." Lucas's jaw tightened. "What are you going to do, huh? You think you can just walk in here and change things?" Amara's eyes flashed with quiet fury. "No, Lucas, I'm not going to change anything. But I will make you see the consequences of your actions. You're not the only one who matters in this world." With those words, she turned and started to walk away, disappearing into the trees as silently as she had come. Lucas stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Her words lingered in his mind like a warning he couldn't ignore. The next few days passed slowly for Lucas. He was unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He had never been afraid of anyone, but there was something about Amara, something in her calm, determined demeanor, that made him question everything he thought he knew. She wasn't just a widow with a grudge. She was someone who had the power to bring him down piece by piece, without ever having to raise a hand. It was on the third day after his encounter with Amara that disaster finally struck. Lucas had decided to visit his ranch again to check on the progress of his men, who had been repairing the well. They had spent days working on it, but it still wasn't operational. As he rode toward the ranch, his mind was filled with thoughts of the cattle he had yet to recover, the growing discontent among his workers, and the relentless pressure of trying to hold everything together. As he approached the ranch, something caught his eye. In the distance, smoke was rising from the direction of the barn. His heart raced as he spurred his horse forward, the wind whipping against his face. He reached the barn just in time to see one of his men rush out, his face pale with fear. "It's gone up in flames, sir," the man shouted. "The whole barn's on fire." Lucas dismounted quickly, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled air. The barn, where he kept his most valuable tools, equipment, and supplies, was burning rapidly. The fire seemed to have started at the back, where the wooden structure was weakest. Lucas could hear the crackling of the fire and the screams of his men, who were scrambling to control the flames. "No," Lucas shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. The fire had already spread too far. He could see the wood beginning to warp and splinter, the flames leaping higher with every passing second. There was no way to save the barn now. His workers tried desperately to save what they could, but it was hopeless. As the fire continued to rage, Lucas stood there helpless. His wealth, his livelihood, and everything he had worked for were going up in smoke. The one place he thought he could always rely on, the place where he kept his tools, his supplies, and his pride, was now a pile of ashes. As the fire finally began to die down, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins in its wake, Lucas stood among the wreckage, his chest heaving with frustration and disbelief. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who had done this? How had they known where to strike? Then, as if the world itself was mocking him, Lucas heard a voice behind him. "You don't learn, do you?" He turned around to see Amara standing at the edge of the ruins, her eyes cold but steady. She had been watching from a distance, waiting for this moment. "This is what happens when you think you can control everything," she said, her voice low but filled with a quiet power. "You destroy what you don't understand. And now you've lost everything." Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had no defense, no excuses. The destruction of his barn, the scattering of his cattle, and the failure of his well, he was out of answers. He had tried to fight back, but in the end, it had only made things worse. Amara turned and walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the distance, leaving Lucas alone among the ashes of his once proud ranch. The lesson had been learned, but it had come at a price Lucas was now forced to pay. His pride, once unshakable, had been broken, and the Apache widow he had underestimated had won. The wind blew gently across the plains, carrying with it a sense of change. Lucas Cole's once thriving ranch was now in ruins, the remnants of his former life scattered across the land like broken dreams. The fire that had destroyed his barn was the final blow in a series of events that had slowly chipped away at the life he had built. And yet, as he stood among the ashes staring into the empty horizon, Lucas could not shake the feeling that his downfall had been inevitable. He had spent days trying to recover, rallying his men, attempting to restore order to the chaos that had engulfed his life. But nothing seemed to work. His cattle remained lost, his workers were restless, and his own spirit was broken. His wealth, once a symbol of his power and control, felt like a distant memory. He was no longer the proud cowboy who had ridden through the village with a cocky smile. He was a man humbled, and the truth of his situation weighed heavily on him. As the days passed, Lucas could feel his pride slowly turning into something else: regret. For the first time in his life, he realized the depth of his arrogance. The Apache widow Amara had struck at the heart of everything he had ever known. She had shown him that no amount of money or power could protect him from the consequences of his actions. One morning, as Lucas sat in his cabin, staring out at the remnants of his ranch, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. He had grown used to the silence that had settled over the land, but the noise of an approaching rider caught his attention. He stood up and walked to the door, his heart racing. It could be one of his men, or perhaps someone else who had come to see the destruction for themselves. But as the rider drew closer, Lucas recognized the silhouette. It was Amara. She rode towards him with the same quiet confidence that had unsettled him from the moment they had met. She was calm, composed, and unbothered by the destruction surrounding them. Her gaze was steady as she rode up to him, her eyes never leaving his. She stopped her horse just a few feet away and dismounted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lucas stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what to say. The woman who had brought him to his knees, who had turned his world upside down, was standing before him. There was no anger in her expression now, no fury. There was only a quiet strength that radiated from her, a strength that he could no longer ignore. "I suppose you're here to see the result of your work," Lucas said, his voice rough with a mix of frustration and resignation. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew that this moment had been coming. He had brought this on himself. Amara regarded him with calm eyes. "I didn't come here to gloat, Lucas," she said softly. "I came because you need to understand something." Lucas frowned, his patience thinning. "What is that?" Amara took a deep breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "You think that because you have money, you can control everything and everyone. But you're wrong. You're just like everyone else, vulnerable, flawed, and capable of making mistakes. Lucas opened his mouth to argue, but Amara raised her hand, silencing him. "You think you can destroy people with your wealth and power?" she continued, her voice unwavering. "But there are consequences for that, and you've seen them." Lucas's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. The fire, the cattle, the workers leaving, all of it had been his punishment. And still, he could not escape the feeling that something had been taken from him, something deeper than the land or his money. "You think this is enough?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You've taken everything from me. What more do you want?" Amara's expression softened, but there was no pity in her gaze. "I don't want anything from you, Lucas. I only want you to understand. I want you to learn from this. Because if you don't, if you continue down the same path, you'll never be able to change." For the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Lucas felt a flicker of understanding. He realized that what Amara had done was not just about revenge. It was about showing him the consequences of his arrogance, the flaws in his thinking, and the way he had treated others, especially the Apache people. She hadn't destroyed him to get back at him. She had destroyed his pride, his sense of control, and his belief that money could solve everything. And it worked. Slowly but surely, Lucas was beginning to understand. He had been blind to the suffering of others, too focused on his own success to see the damage he was causing. The Apache people, his workers, the land. It had all been a part of a much bigger picture that he had failed to see. "You were right," Lucas said, his voice quieter now, tinged with something he hadn't felt before: humility. "I thought I could do whatever I wanted. I thought I was untouchable. But I see now that I've made a lot of mistakes." Amara nodded as if she had been expecting this moment all along. "It's never too late to change, Lucas, but it has to come from you. No one can change you except yourself." The silence between them was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Lucas stood there watching the woman who had humiliated him, who had brought him to his knees yet had done so in a way that was somehow more powerful than any violence could have been. She had made him see the truth about himself, and for the first time he understood the full depth of his arrogance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amara spoke again. "I came here because I wanted you to know that this isn't personal. I didn't want to destroy you, Lucas. I wanted to make sure you saw what your actions did to others. The pain you caused, the lives you ruined, it was never just about you." Lucas nodded, his throat tight. "I understand. And I will make things right, Amara. I promise you that." Amara didn't smile, but her eyes softened. She turned and walked toward her horse, ready to leave the man who had once thought himself invincible. She had taught him a lesson, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As she mounted her horse and prepared to ride away, Lucas called out to her. "Amara," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't do it for thanks, Lucas. I did it because it was the right thing to do." With those final words, Amara rode off into the distance, leaving Lucas behind. He stood there, watching her disappear into the vast expanse of the plains, feeling a sense of something he had never known before. A deep, lasting change that could not be undone.